Hello, my name is Kenneth Harry Underwood II. I am the great-grandson of a Civil War veteran who fought on both the Yankees and the Confederate side. I am the son of Lieutenant Kenneth Harry Underwood, and I am the father of Captain Kenneth Harrison Underwood. Lieutenant Underwood was a World War II fighter pilot, and Captain Underwood is the current United States Air Force fighter pilot. I want to thank Holly and the Friends of the World War II Memorial for inviting me to speak to you today. We want to talk about World War II. World War II is as you know, hard for younger folks to grasp. It was, to me, I think of, to them, World War II is like Civil War was to me when I was a kid. It was a long time ago, and they don't really study it that much. So I want to bring attention to one story. There were 400,000 plus men and women killed in World War II for the United States. I want to talk about one. This is the story, my personal story, of a boy who never knew his father, but grew up later to be a man who came to love, respect, and honor his father. And I think you'll understand when I get into the story. Stalin once said, "A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths, it's a statistic." And there's a lot of truth to it, I think. I want to start, if I may, with a book entitled Mission of Honor by Dan Henry. This is a story that I did not know about. I did not know until I met Dan. When he contacted me, he told me that his wife's aunt's husband was a P-38 Lightning pilot who happened to be my father's best friend. I did not know this story at all. Of course, I didn't know my father, and we didn't know anything much about him and what happened. So when he contacted me, he said that when his wife, aunt, Mary Ellen, passed away, they looked through all of her belongings and they found a stack of letters that were written to her by my father. And on March the 18th, 1944, his group, the 55th Fighter Group, was engaged in a furious dogfight with the Germans in southern France. Brad was hit, his right engine caught on fire, and my father saw him. He watched him as long as he could, because of course he was pretty busy himself fighting, dogfighting with the Germans. But he was sure he saw the fire go out, and he was sure that Brad was headed towards Switzerland. If our flyers could get to Switzerland, there was a neutral area, and the Swiss would protect them. So that's what he thought. Well, he kept writing to Mary Ellen. And if I may, I'd like to read something to you. Dear Mary Ellen, I really don't know how to start this letter, as it is the hardest one I've ever attempted. Lieutenant Weasel and I figured you'd like to know the facts as best we can give them. Wick was last seen deep in France, but the plane was under control. It is my opinion that Wick bailed out and is trying to escape. If not, then he is a prisoner of war. In no doubt he is well and happy. As soon as you hear from him, and we hope it's darn soon, please let us know. Have no fear for Mary Ellen, for Wick, for I know he is all right, and he was always capable of taking care of himself. Please forgive me if this letter has bungled up and led you astray, but I'm sure if we pray hard enough, Wick will be with you soon. He is my best buddy, and I'd rather lose my right arm than to have him gone. So, sadly, things got worse, as the author writes, as Lieutenant Underwood was killed in a plane crash May the 18th, 1944, just 2 months after Lieutenant Bookholm went down. The letters stopped coming, and Mary Ellen didn't know what happened to Ken, Lieutenant Underwood. This is just one thing I like for people to understand who see this video. There are 400,000 deaths, but each one of them has a story. Each one of them has a family behind them. Lieutenant Bookholm did not make it. And it's a sad story. And Mary Ellen never remarried. I guess my story starts on May the 17th of 1944. My father wrote 2 letters to my mother that night. He was the officer on duty that night. And he talked about D-Day. He said, we know it's coming, we just don't know when. As it turned out, it was less than 3 weeks later. But he wrote those 2 letters on May the 17th. 3 days later, my mother was sitting on her front porch at her parents' house in Topeka, Kansas, with her sister, my Aunt Tess. An Army car pulled up in front of their neighbor. My aunt said to my mother, "Why are they pulling up in front of the Miller's house? They don't have anyone in the service." My mother said, "They're looking for me." My Aunt Tess said, "What?" She says, "I had a dream last night." She said, "I saw the skies open up and Ken was looking down, smiling at me." Sure enough, the man brought the telegram over. And they said, "We regret to tell you that your husband, Lieutenant Kenneth H. Underwood, was killed near Bury St. Edmunds, England, in a plane accident. A letter to follow." Well, no letter followed that explained anything. There was no funeral for her to attend. She never received a flag, to the best of my knowledge. There was no closure for her. And thus begins the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. So my mother remarried when I was 3 to a wonderful man. I had the pleasure and the honor of having the greatest dad I could ever have be my stepdad. He was never my stepdad. He was always my dad. And 4 years later, along came my brother. He was never my stepbrother. He was my brother. And things were good. We lived out on a farm. A little rough at times in Kansas, but I always felt like we had an Ozzie and Harriet moment living out there on the farm. So everything was fine. I always wondered, though, what did he sound like? What did his voice sound like? How did he walk? I never had those opportunities to see him walk, talk, play golf. He never had a time to see me grow up, be a father, have a son. And so I always felt bad for him because he never got to be a dad. He never got to be a father. He didn't know if he had a boy or a girl. He just knew that my mother was 7.5 months pregnant when all this happened. So she was 22 years old. He was 22 years old. And there's so many of these stories that I think people need to understand, because we're losing almost all of our greatest generation now. It's very hard to find any that are alive, any that saw combat. And so I hope that this will help the students to maybe do some research and look into World War II, to see what it was all about. Because it truly was a world war, and we truly did save the world. If it weren't for us, the old saying is, the English would be speaking German today. And I think that's probably pretty true. But life went on. I grew up, always wondered about my father. What did it look like where the crash occurred? Bury St. Edmunds, where's that? And this before the internet and all that kind of stuff. Google, it was hard to find out any information. And so I didn't know exactly what to think. When I was about 11 or 12, my parents came to me and said that my stepfather wanted to adopt me, and it would be my decision. Well, that's a pretty heavy burden to put on an 11, 12-year-old boy. They never put any pressure on me. They never put a date on it. But I cried myself to sleep many nights thinking, what do I do? I loved my stepdad, my dad. I loved him. He and I had the same birthday, actually, July 3rd. And my mother always said, well, yeah, that's why I married him. But he was a wonderful man. But I also thought about my father. I was named after him. I had his name. He was a war hero. He was killed. He gave his life for his country. I had to honor him, too. So I decided to keep my name, and it was fine. My dad was just fine with it. He was a great man. And so nothing really occurred until October of 1985. In October 1985, my parents and I went to the Air Force Academy to attend a a reunion of my father's 55th Fighter Group. And I thought, well, boy, this is really going to be something, you know. Get to talk to people who knew him. And so we went. And Mom and Dad were upstairs, and I went down, and I was mingling among all the fellows down there. Of course, I didn't know anybody. And I was walking around saying, excuse me, did you ever know Lieutenant Kenneth Underwood? Ken Underwood? No. How about you, sir? No. How about you, sir? No. No, nobody knew. And then I hear a voice behind me saying, did I hear you ask about Lieutenant Underwood? I said, I turned around, and here's this rather smallish fellow. And I said, yes, did you know him? He said, yes, I did. I was his crew chief. Sergeant Don Maloney. Well, that was just an awesome moment for me. He started telling stories about my dad to me. And I was crying and laughing at the same time. It was just a really emotional meeting. But he was wonderful and told me about how he put him in the cockpit and put his gloves on. You know, in the wintertime over there, they're up there at 30, 40,000 feet. And they didn't have a heater. The P-38, if I may, show this P-38 Lightning. It was one of the finest, not the finest fighter planes we had. The P-51 Mustang gets all the glory, you know, for winning the war in Europe. Well, I can tell you this. On March the 3rd, 1944, my father's fighter group and his squadron, the 38th Fighter Squadron, were over Berlin. They were the first fighters to make it to Berlin. Unfortunately, it was an overcast day. They couldn't see the targets or anything below them, and they were waiting on a squadron of B-17 bombers to show up to bomb Berlin. Well, the bombers got lost, and in the terrible weather, turned around and went back to England. So my father's group had to go back too. And I can only imagine what the German fighter pilots were thinking. They could hear this plane above them, and they could tell it was a fighter. You can tell the difference between a fighter and a bomber by the sounds, thinking, what kind of airplane is flying over Berlin? You know, Hitler and Goering told us that would never be an airplane, a fighter or bomber over Berlin. Well, that didn't come true, did it? So I met his flight leader, Colonel Jack Jenkins from Texas. And Colonel Jenkins and I were out on the flight line at Peterson Air Force Base, and we were talking, and he said, Ken, he said, none of us know what happened to your father. He said he was a fantastic fighter pilot. He said he was so good that I had him as my wingman for a lot of my missions. You know, I felt very protected with your father on my wing. He said, you know, after we would escort the bombers over to Germany or France or wherever, we would, on the way back to England, we'd see opportunities, targets of opportunity, they're called, airfields with German airplanes in them, or railroad cars, locomotives. We'd drop down and shoot them up. In fact, the 55th Fighter Group's nickname is the Loco Busters. They probably shot up more locomotives than any other outfit in the European Theater of Operations, the ETO. So he said, but your father was, he was gung-ho. He wanted to get right down on the deck, and he'd go right at those locomotives. And he didn't leave himself any room to maneuver. And the Germans were getting smarter. They would have one or two railroad cars that they'd open up, and they'd have anti-aircraft guns. So when our guys would dive at them, they were ready. They started shooting at them. So he said, I told your father I wanted him to work on his angle of attack better regarding attacking railroad locomotives and things like that. He said maybe that's what happened. Well, as we'll find out, he was very prescient. He knew. He had a feeling. So he then looked at me and he said, has anybody here told you how much you look like your father? Boy, that hit me right between the eyes. I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, you do. And I was flying a lot myself at that time. Probably had my Tom Cruise Maverick glasses on, I don't know. But he said I looked like him. And that really was something. But nobody knew. I met other men who told me, oh yeah, your dad's a good pilot. Yeah, I would go into combat with him anytime. We don't know what happened. Some people said maybe he was hot dogging, maybe he was showing off. That's what my mother heard. And she was very upset about that, as you can imagine. What's he doing, showing off and hot dogging? You know, when she told that to me one day, I said, well, Mom, he's a fighter pilot. He better be a hot dog, you know, because that's what they've got to be. They got to be confident. They got to feel like they can do anything on that aircraft. But she wasn't buying it. And I felt bad because we didn't really know. I said, Mom, we don't know what happened. We really don't. And so that was October of 1985. By May of 1986, my mother had developed pancreatic cancer. They gave her 6 months to live. I don't think she made it 6 weeks. And on her deathbed, she said to me, I have never forgiven your father for getting killed when he was not in combat. I just went, oh my, 42 years she's held that in. But that goes back. She got a telegram, letter to father. The letter father that said what happened. She had no funeral for him. He was buried in England. There was no closure. And I could understand that. She loved my stepdad, my dad. They had, as far as I know, a wonderful marriage. It was Ernie and Alice and Ernie. They were a great couple. But she had this anger in her, and she's spitting it out to me on her deathbed. And after she died, I said, I've got to find a guy named Bert Shepard. And that's what several people told me. I said, Bert Shepard might know. He bunked next to your father. He was shot down over Germany 3 days later. But he might know. Oh, I said, well, great. How can I get in touch with Bert? Well, we don't know. We've lost track of him. He hasn't been to we've only had 2 of these reunions, and he hasn't been to either one. Last we heard, he lived in California. I said, I live in California. That shouldn't be trouble finding him. Well, 1986, I kept trying and trying and trying. Now, understand, this was before cell phones and Google and internet. California probably at that time had 20-some million people. But I kept trying. I said, I'm going to find that guy. But I couldn't. It just is impossible. Because you'd have to call every town and ask for a Bert Shepard listed there. So I'd kind of given up on that. I thought, well, that's not going to happen. And I went to an air show, 1988, 89, 90, somewhere in there. It was out in Chino. I heard there was a P-38 going to be flying. I'd never seen one fly. And my mother always told me that there's never a sound like a P-38. And so I wanted to hear it. I wanted to see it. And I went out to this Chino air show, and probably 8 or 10,000 people there, who knows how many. And there was the P-38 flying, and I was standing behind a bank of television cameras, and I was watching it. I ended up actually flying in a plane called the White Lightning, flown by a fellow named Lefty Gardner. That's another story. But I just happened to mention, to talking to myself, I said, boy, now I know what my mom means when she said there's never a plane like a P-38 and never a sound like one. And the fellow next to me said, yeah, you ought to hear it when it has its turbochargers on. That one doesn't have turbochargers on. Oh, wow. And I said, well, my father flew one in the war. He said, yeah, I flew one too. So I turned to say hi to him. Bert Shepard, name tag. He was at the air show with the group, and it was Bert Shepard, staying right next to me, out of 8 or 10,000 people. How do you explain that? I tell people things, starting with that and some other things, the bookies in Vegas wouldn't put odds on. How do you look for somebody for 2 years or more and then go out to an air show where there's thousands of people and you're standing right next to the man? Well, the Channel 7 reporter heard us, and he came over and interviewed us and put us on television that afternoon. But I got to know Bert. What happened to Bert's interesting too, if I may, because people need to hear these stories, I think, because they just think, well, it was a war, soldiers, but like I said, every death, every injury has a story behind it. 3 days after my father was killed, Bert was on a mission over Germany. And after they bombed, they escorted the bombers, they dropped down and shoot up a German airfield. And Bert went down in real low and shooting up, and he pulled up. And he said, I felt something strange. And I looked down at my foot. He said, I pulled my leg up. My foot stayed down on the bottom of the cockpit. Said they shot my foot off. He said it made me so darn mad. He said, I'm going to go back and hit him again. So his squad leader told him to form up and head back to England. Well, Bert disregarded. He went around again. He came down again, low again, shooting him up. Boy, they got him. He crashed. He was thrown out of his P-38 Lightning. He hit the dash on the way out, put a pretty big bad dent in his head. He said, Kenny, when I came to, he said, I was lying out in the field, and German farmers were coming at me with pitchforks. They did that. The Germans would kill pilots if they could. They would kill them if they had guns or pitchforks. It happened more than you would like to know. And he said, all I had was my 45, and he said I had 6 shots. I said, well, I'm going to take as many as I can before they kill me. And he said, then out of nowhere comes a German patrol car, and a colonel was in it, and he raised his Luger and he fired it several times to get the people to leave me alone. And they took me to a POW camp. So while Bert was in the POW camp, he had to have his lower leg amputated. And a Canadian there who was in the camp with him made him a stump. So he had that for over a year, a stump with crutches in the POW camp. But what's interesting is that Bert came back after the war, and he was at Walter Reed Hospital here in Washington, D.C., going through rehabilitation, getting a prosthesis for his leg, when the Secretary of Defense came around. And he said, well, Bert, what are you going to do with your life now? Well, Bert was a big, strapping, 6'2" Indiana farm boy. And he said, well, sir, he said, I was pitching in the Chicago Cubs organization, and I was moving up quite rapidly. I want to pitch in the major leagues. And the secretary looked at him and says, yeah, well, what about that? Oh, no problem. So I can do anything. I got a wooden leg. I can do anything anybody else can do. Oh, he said, I just want a chance. I just want an opportunity to try to pitch in the major leagues. So the Secretary of Defense called up Clark Griffith, who owned Griffith Stadium. And Mr. Griffith says, well, heck yeah, he's a war hero. Give him a try. He made the team. He pitched with a wooden leg. Now, I want to fast forward, if I may, because the teachers in particular, some of you will know the characters in this little quick story. So Bert and I met, and I used to hang out down the LA Dodgers training room. I knew the trainers down there, and I'd go down. So I took Bert down there one day, and walking around, and he took off, and he's walking around. And I saw Tommy Lasorda, and I said, Tommy, I have a friend here I'd like to have you meet. Oh, really? He said, yeah. I said, he was a P-38 Lightning pilot like my father in World War II. And the darndest thing, I said, he was shot down. He lost his lower leg in the crash. It had to be amputated. He came back, and he pitched for the Washington Senators. And if anybody knows Tommy Lasorda, it was, Bert Shepard's here? Bert Shepard's here? Where? He was my hero. I was a teenager during the war. Bert Shepard's here? So we find Bert, and we go into his office. Some of you may or may not have seen the Frank Sinatra movie featuring a P-38 Lightning pilot. And as the movie begins, you see a P-38 going across the top of the screen with smoke coming out behind it. And you see it go over a copse of trees, and you see the explosion. Well, we walked into Tommy's office, and there in this great big framed picture was the two tails sticking out in the horizontal stabilizer. And Sinatra's in his Air Force flying uniform. He's doing this. Hey. And he wrote, hey, Tommy, so I blew it. And I went, what are the odds? What are the odds of that? A P-38 Lightning and some of the, and Bert Shepard. So then Bert said, Tommy said, Bert, you know, some of the old guys, tell some stories. Well, Bert says, oh, you guys all know Yogi Berra. Oh, yeah, everybody knows Yogi, right? Well, he said, I was pitching against the Yankees in an exhibition game, and I struck Yogi out 3 times. Yeah, he said, about 10 years later, we were both at a charity function in D.C. raising money for wounded veterans like myself. And I remember Bert's 6'2", and Yogi's probably about 5'7", if that. And he said, Yogi came up to me and goes, hey, ain't you the guy who struck me out 3 times one night? Yeah, Yogi, that was me. Wow. He said, you were a heck of a pitcher. He said, man, you could have made a big in the major leagues, but I heard you had your leg cut off. You got in an accident. Well, Yogi, I had that leg on the night I struck you out 3 times. No. Yeah, it was the coaches and sort of were rolling around. But back to Bert Shepard. Bert said to me, Ken, I heard he went up to a bomber base, the 94th Bomb Group. It's like 60 miles north of us. And there was a railroad channeling yard there. You know, trains going in and out. And he said, but we heard he went up to see a friend of his from Topeka. But we don't know for sure. You know, he didn't come back, so we don't know. But he said your dad did like to show off a little bit, especially doing some takeoff stuff and things like that. Maybe that's what happened. And I'm thinking, now we know how my mother heard about hot dogging and things like that. But anyway, he didn't know. But that channeling yard was there. But he said, Ken, why don't you write to the 94th Bomb Squadron? They have a newsletter. Just put in a letter in there saying, hey, does anybody remember a P-38 crashing on May the 18th of 1944? Because there were no P-38 bases up there. We just had some bomber bases up there. Well, I said, okay. I mean, it's a long shot, but I wrote a letter. I sent it off to the bomb group's newsletter. Didn't think anything more about it. Some time went by, quite a bit of time actually, and one day, I was now living in Dallas, a letter came to me. It was addressed to me, but it had a return address from Lethbridge, Canada, Alberta. Normally, I'd probably take that and toss it in the mail, in the trash. Well, it sat around for a couple of days, and one day I decided to pick it up. And I started reading it, and burst into tears. It took me a long time to get through the letter. The letter was from a professor of English. His name was Brian Tyson. Brian was an 11-year-old boy in England in May of 1944, and his brother, Patrick, was 13. And they saw a P-38 Lightning go over their heads. They saw a plexiglass canopy drop and float through the air, shattering in a million pieces. And he said, we saw the plane go over a row of trees and we saw the smoke come up. So we ran to our house. We got our bicycles. We bicycled over there. By the time we got there, the MPs were there, the military police, had it cordoned off, and there was no pilot. So all these years, we just assumed the pilot had made it, bailed out, or done something. And the older brother, Patrick, sneaked in behind the military police and he pulled out a piece of my father's airplane, of your father's airplane. I'm still quoting from the letter. And he said, toward the end of the letter, and he said, oh, by the way, he still has it. Oh my gosh, this is just, what are the odds, okay? What are the odds? And so next thing you know, I'm on a plane to England. And I'm staying at a bed and breakfast, and a man asked me why I was there, and I told him I was meeting a man who had saved a piece of my father's airplane from a crash in May of 1944. And oh, by the way, he thinks he can still find the tree that he crashed into that killed him. It's out near Little Saxon. Well, next thing you know, the phone's ringing in my room, and the local newspaper wanted to accompany us. So we all met the next morning, and we go out, and Mr. Tyson is driving, looking for signs that he could remember. I understand now, my father was killed on May the 18th in 1944. This is now May the 18th, 1992. 48 years today he died. So we get out there, and we can kind of see a trail. We're not sure. So I say, well, there's a cottage over there. Let's go ask the person who lives there. And it turned out to be a young lady who was living there with her husband, and her husband's father, Tom Mann, I call him Farmer Mann, owned the cottage and the farmland. So they called him up, and he came right over. Wonderful man. He said, oh, yes, Ken. He said, I was 16 at the time. He said, I remember it quite well. He says, the tree is still out there. Wow. So we go walking out there, all of us, the reporters and the photographer and Mr. and Mrs. Tyson, Mr. Mann and myself. And we're walking down this tunnel, if you will, of trees. And I asked about, what is this path? He said, well, this is pilgrims, I don't know what else to call them, way back, would travel on this path when they were going to the Bury, at Bury St. Edmunds. That's a big cathedral, that's what it was called. I went, oh my God, Bury St. Edmunds, the telegram. He was killed near Bury St. Edmunds. Oh boy, this is all starting to come together. So we walked for a while, and lo and behold, there it is. So we're there, we're looking at the tree, and oh my God, there it is. The bark was burned off so high. Still charcoal on the tree. All the trees, and before we got there, I need to back up, I had written to the Air Force about my father's accident. And they wrote back and said, they sent an accident report. Bert had also suggested I do this, Bert Shepard. We go down to, I read the whole accident report, and down at the bottom, over here, it says, cause of accident, here, blacked out. What? This was 40-some years later, so I wrote back to the Air Force, and they said they rejected it. I have letters to that effect. They said, we can't tell you. I'm thinking, was he on some kind of a secret mission? I don't think so. Why can't they tell me what the problem was? And they explained it. Well, witnesses come forward to talk, and if their testimony is not kept secret, they're not liable to say anything. That they just, wouldn't tell me. But they did send, on the second time, they sent Xerox copies of photographs taken at the crash site in May of 1944. It was pretty gruesome for me to look at because the plane was just scattered all over the place. And it's a big aircraft, as you can see from the model. And so I had those pictures blown up, and I took them with me to England. So the farmer, Mr. Mann, and I are walking out in the field. My father was going from north to south. He hit in the north field, hit the tree line, blew up. What was left scattered out into the south field. And I was holding his picture, and I said, Mr. Mann, it looks to me like the photographer was standing right about here when he took this picture, because you could see the tree. Of course, all the trees are going back in, but there's that half-dead, half-alive tree, and it was so obvious. And he said, well, yeah, Ken. He said, this is about where your father, what was left, the plane came to rest, about right here. Oh, my gosh. And then he looked down at the ground, and he said, well, what's this? And he starts kicking at the ground. And up comes a piece of my father's airplane. Unbelievable. Riveted, you can tell it's military aircraft, just from this. He said, Ken, for 48 years I've farmed this land. For 48 years I've tried to find another piece of your father's aircraft, and I've never found anything. And now here you are, standing right here, and this piece comes up. Figure the odds on that, Vegas. You can't. So that was quite a remarkable time, as you can imagine. And at the same time, when I was there, Mr. Tyson, the man who saved the piece, the rudder, gave me this. This was what he had taken as a teenager from the wreckage in May of '44. So it was pretty emotional. And so I went back to Dallas, got married, Started having children. In 1997, we went back again because a book had been written about my father. And in it is my chapter called My Father's Son at Last. And I came up with that title when I was there in 1992. The local paper did a full page of me and half of another page. And I went in to send flowers to my then fiance, Diana, in Dallas. And the lady said, "Are you the gentleman who found your father's tree yesterday?" I said, "Yes, I am." She says, "Hold on." She brings back, goes in the back, comes out with a sleeve, a plastic sleeve with a rose in it and a note card. And my English teacher, the educators, had always wanted me to be a writer. He said to me, "Ken, when you're over there, think, what does this mean to you? What does this mean to you?" And so when I went back out with the rose to the tree, I said, "What does it mean to me?" And it came to me. My father's son at last. And that was a really emotional moment. When we came back in 1997, my son was 4 years old, now fighter pilot. My daughter was 2. And we went with Mr. Mann again. This time, Anglia Television came along to record this. And we'll send a link to y'all because I think it'd be worthwhile to view it. It's only like 4 minutes long. But when we went out there, Mr. and Mrs. Tyson were there, the television people, Mr. Mann, myself, and Mr. Mann's granddaughter. I think she was about 10 or 11 years old. And so when we went out there to the tree, I went out to the north field where he went, and I'm talking to him. I'm just looking up going, "Are you here today? Are you here? You were here last time because we found that piece. Farmer Mann, we found that piece. Are you here?" And about that time, I heard them calling my name, and I turned around, and everybody's gathered around the tree looking kind of solemn. Oh my gosh, what's going on here? So I walked back over, and you'll see this in the video. But at the same time, exactly, that I was saying, "Are you here today?" The farmer, Mr. Mann, and his granddaughter were out in that other field. And she said, "Grandpa, what's this?" He said, "Look down." Laying on the surface of the ground was the remnants of one of my father's flying shoes. Put odds on that. What are they? You can't. It was a pretty emotional moment, as you can imagine. But he was there, wasn't he? He guided us again. And the man who wrote the book, the USAF Fighter Stories, it's a 1997 edition, Ian McLaughlin, he actually has a television show on Netflix called Plane Resurrection. He's a knowledgeable man who works with people. They dig up wreckages of World War II aircraft and others that crash, and they restore them. So he said, yes, that was Army Air Corps issue boot. It was my father's boot. And so that was pretty much it. One last thing I'd like to say is my son now is an F-15E Strike Eagle pilot. He went to Kansas State University, went to Air Force ROTC, then he went to Vance Air Force Base. When he graduated from there, I was able to pin his grandfather's World War II fighter pilot wings on him, which was a moment I'd waited all my life to do, and all his life. He now is a combat decorated pilot. Both he and my father have been awarded air medals. My father in 1944, my son for his actions in 2019, and when you put them right next to each other, you cannot tell the difference, 77 years later. So I would like to show this painting. It's by Matthew Emeny, E-M-E-N-Y, that's Emeny Arts. He is an artist in England. He heard about my story, and my father's story, and my son's story. And he painted this original painting. This is my father in his P-38 Lightning, in exact markings as he flew it. The white marks around his nose. This is where the machine guns and the cannons were all on the nose. And Sergeant Maloney told me my son didn't want my father didn't want nose art, so he said we had to figure out some way to make it so we knew it was his airplane. So they painted, because they'd watch when the guys come back from missions. You know, did our guy come? Did he make it back? So they painted white on there. H, and this is his squadron, his fighter group. CGH was his call signs, and he is flying as wingman for my son, who's right here, in the F-15E Strike Eagle, out of Seymour Johnson, North Carolina. And that is just an amazing painting. When people see this and know about aircraft and fighters, it's an amazing painting. So I did want to bring attention to that. And it can be seen at Emeny Art, E-M-E-N-Y, Art, online. You can probably find it somewhere. Matthew Emeny. It's a wonderful painting. And one last thing. So my daughter was married on April the 16th of this year in Austin. So I asked her when she told me the date she was going to get married on. I said, "Did you know that was your grandfather's 100th birthday?" "No, Dad." She goes, "I knew there was something about that date, but I couldn't think of what it was." I said, "Well, he knew. He helped you pick that date." And my son, back in '92, when we found out we were going to have a boy, the doctor said, "Well, we think his birth date will be," you ready? "April 16th. Naturally, because my son Harrison has this need for speed, he came on March 27th. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be open for questions. Thank you.